In June 1944, an officer in the German Military Intelligence Division received a report from his most trusted spy in London. As he picked up his telephone, he began to smile, knowing that this new information would change the tide of the war in Germany's favor. Well, that report would go on to alter the course of World War II, but just not in the way that he'd expected. On February 14th, 1914, a boy named Juan Pujol García was born in Barcelona to parents Joan and Mercedes. Joan owned a cotton factory, and with his savvy business sense, he provided a really comfortable living for the family. They were so well off, in fact, that at the age of 7, Juan was sent to a prestigious boarding school. He remained there for the next 4 years, with his father making a 32-kilometer trip to visit him every single week. While Juan enjoyed a comfortable monetary life growing up, things were anything but smooth at home. His mother had come from a very strict Catholic family and took communion every single day, whereas his father, on the other hand, was a secular atheist. This stark difference in values between mother and father resulted in many tense arguments growing up. These type of situations always make me ponder the importance of having values alignment in romantic relationships. Not just for the two people who are involved in the relationship, but also for the benefit of any children that they may bring into the world down the road. When Juan was 13 years old, he was transferred to another school in Barcelona, which was run by one of his father's good friends. It was shortly into his studies at this new school that Juan's tendency to question authority began to bubble to the surface. After an intense political argument with one of his teachers, he decided that he no longer wished to stay at the school, so he promptly walked out the front gate and found a job as an apprentice at a hardware store. Very predictably, though, Juan quickly grew bored of his role at the hardware store and worked a number of odd jobs in the years leading up to the Spanish Civil War. He studied animal husbandry at the Royal Poultry School and also managed many different businesses, including a cinema. In 1931, very suddenly, Juan's father passed away. The loss was devastating to the family, and in particular Juan. There he was, just 17 years old, facing the dark reality of death far earlier than a young man should have to face that. The only positive really was that Juan's father had left the family very well off financially before he died. I suppose there's never a good time to lose a parent. It always leaves a wound that will never fully heal, but if we're lucky enough to not face that tragedy until our 50s or maybe even our 60s, we're perhaps better equipped. We've seen more of the world and we've learned ourselves better to where we can handle the weight of that loss better. Whereas at 17, we're just beginning the long and arduous process of finding our way in the world. The death of Juan's father caused a shift in his approach to life. For the first time, he learned just how finite and precious time really is. And he realized that he no longer had any time to lose in building the life that he wanted. So just 2 months after the loss of his father, Juan enrolled in the military to complete his 6 months of compulsory service so that he could resume his studies at the poultry school as soon as possible. From the moment Juan began his military service, he knew that he was not suited to that lifestyle at all. He hated horseback riding and claimed to lack the qualities of loyalty, generosity, and honor that were a requirement in the Spanish military. Well, that's not exactly a positive self-reflection. That kind of conclusion, I think, does show an impressive amount of self-awareness for a 17-year-old boy. I think that most teenagers lack these positive traits since they haven't yet been given an opportunity to develop them, yet few are really aware of their own deficiencies. Juan finished up his military service and didn't look back. He resumed his studies at the Royal Poultry School before graduating and buying his own farm in 1933. For the next 3 years, Juan lived his dream. He built a small home on his farm and he managed his chickens, undisturbed by the external authority of bosses or teachers. He was a free young man with the world at his fingertips. Juan woke up each day with an invigorated heart, eager to take on the chores of his farm and keep building his dream. That continued until 1936, when his hopes and dreams for the future were shattered by the Spanish Civil War. Now, most of you watching this right now probably know your history pretty well, but if you're anything like I was before I researched for this video, then you don't actually know a whole lot about the Spanish Civil War. I feel like its pages in history have maybe been overshadowed by that kind of famous conflict that started in Europe 3 years later. So, for the sake of this story, I'm going to provide a little insight into the Spanish Civil War. As the economic impacts of the Great Depression extended across the globe, Europeans became more and more dissatisfied with their governments. This was particularly true in Spain. A right-wing group known as the Nationalists, led by Francisco Franco, attempted to overthrow the left-leaning Republican government that was in power at that time. When the initial coup failed to take control of the whole country, Franco launched the country into a bloody civil war. The Nationalists were supported by Italy and Nazi Germany, and the Republicans received aid from the Soviet Union, along with volunteer troops from other parts of Europe, Canada, and the US. Juan was called up for military service on the Republican side, but he fiercely opposed them because they had stolen his father's factory several years earlier. Rather than report for duty, he hid in his girlfriend's home until he was later captured by police on a raid and imprisoned for over a week. He was freed by a resistance group who provided him with fake identity papers which showed him to be too old for military service. Over the next 2 years, Juan managed a poultry farm that had been taken over by the Republican government, but it quickly proved to not be a very profitable enterprise. The experience only intensified his distaste for communism. After becoming entirely fed up with the experience in the government-run poultry farm, Juan rejoined the Republican military using yet another set of false identity papers. He intended to desert as soon as possible and volunteered to run telegraph cables near the front lines in order to make desertion easier. In September 1938, he finally got his chance. He ran as fast as he could from the Republican Army and joined the Nationalists, but he quickly found himself just as at odds with the Nationalists as he had been on the other side. When he voiced differing opinions to his comrades, he was beaten and imprisoned by his ranking officer. After he was finally released from prison and discharged from the Nationalist Army, Juan ended the Civil War with the unique experience of having fought for both sides. This perspective left him with a deep hatred for both the fascists and the communists, and by extension, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Shortly after the conflict ended, Juan met and married a woman, and they had one son together. Exhausted with war, Juan looked forward to a quiet life with his wife and son, but those plans would change just 1 year later. Shortly after the outbreak of World War II, Juan decided that he wanted to help Britain in their fight against Nazi Germany. So, in January of 1941, he approached the British Embassy in Madrid 3 times, offering his services as a spy, but the British showed no interest in pursuing this with him. Unperturbed, Juan resolved to become a German spy before later approaching the British again and offering his services as a double agent, which would be much more valuable in his mind and an offer that they just couldn't refuse. Juan created a false identity as a pro-Nazi Spanish government official who frequently traveled to London on business. He then contacted a Nazi military intelligence agent in Madrid and was accepted into their spy program. The Nazis gave him a crash course on espionage, a bottle of invisible ink, and £600 for travel expenses. His instructions were to move to London and create a network of local British spies. Juan instead moved to Lisbon because he much preferred the sunshine of Portugal to the dreary grey skies in England. Using tourist guides, books, and magazines from a public library, he actually created believable reports that appeared to come from London. In these reports, he claimed to be traveling around Britain and submitted travel expenses to the Nazis based on fares that he found listed in a British railway guide. While living in Lisbon, he created an extensive network of fake spies around the UK, as this had been his original assignment from the Germans. His phony reports were so credible that when the British Secret Service organization, called the MI5, started intercepting these reports, they launched a full-scale hunt for this supposed spy. Frustrated that he still wasn't being taken seriously by the British as a valuable resource, Juan approached the United States government in February 1942 just after they had entered the war. He spoke with an American Navy lieutenant named Patrick Demorest, who was stationed in Lisbon. Seeing Juan's huge potential for the Allied war effort, Demorest contacted the British military. Before this contact was made, the British had become aware that someone was misinforming the Germans. Much to British delight, the Germans had recently wasted a bunch of military resources hunting down some non-existent convoy that had been reported to them by Juan. After Demorest's intervention, Juan was moved to Britain in April 1942, and after passing a security check, he was finally made an official double agent for the British government. Juan was given the code name Garbo after the beautiful, legendary Swedish actress Greta Garbo. Now, Juan didn't speak a word of English, and with him now living in the UK and acting as an official agent for the British military, this posed a significant problem. To combat the issue, he was paired with an MI5 agent named Thomas Harris, who spoke both fluent English and Spanish and really helped as a translator. Together, the two of them wrote 315 letters to the Germans with reports that again were so believable that the Germans stopped any further attempt to recruit additional spies in the UK because they felt like that need was met with Garbo. The information that Juan supplied to the Germans was a mixture of complete fiction, genuine information with little military importance, and valuable reports that were delayed until they weren't useful anymore. In November 1942, before the British landings in North Africa, Garbo truthfully reported that a convoy of troop ships had left port painted in desert camouflage. He sent the letter by airmail and postmarked it before the landings were scheduled, but it was then intentionally delayed by British intelligence so that it would be too late to be of any use. Garbo later received a message from the Germans that stated, "We're very sorry they arrived too late, but your last reports were magnificent." During the first part of the war, Garbo conducted most of his communication with the Germans through courier. Then in 1943, after the Germans requested a faster mode of communication, Garbo created a fictitious radio operator known by the codename as Alaric to the Germans. No longer able to hide behind the delay of mailed reports, the British now had to invent reasons why Garbo wasn't reporting important information that the Germans would eventually learn about down the road. In one such fabrication, Garbo reported that one of his fictitious agents from that network that he was supposedly creating had become very sick shortly before a major fleet move out of port in England. To support the story, the agent died from illness and was unable to report the event. To further convince the Germans, a false obituary was placed in a local English newspaper. The Germans were so convinced that they even paid a pension to the agent's wife. In reality, all of that money went to Garbo. The move to radio communication actually further benefited the British because in order to conduct this communication safely, the Germans provided Garbo with their cutting-edge encryption system, which he then passed on to British codebreakers. In preparation for the Allied invasion of Europe, Garbo played a huge role in Operation Fortitude, which was a deception campaign to conceal the coming invasion. Between January 1944 and D-Day, Garbo sent over 500 radio messages to the Germans in an effort to make them believe that the Allied attack would happen at the Straits of Dover and not in Normandy, where it actually did happen. To maintain credibility, it was decided that Garbo would inform the Germans of some of the actual details of the invasion, but not enough to really benefit them. They would also be sent too late for the Germans to take any effective action against them. Arrangements were made for a German radio operator to be listening for Garbo around the clock on June 5th and 6th, because again, this is when the Allies were planning their attack. When Garbo called in at 3 a.m. on June 6th, ready to share details of the coming invasion, the German operator was slumped over his desk, asleep. The Germans didn't reply until 8 a.m. that morning, which allowed Garbo to add even more truthful but out-of-date information to his report. When the Germans finally did receive his message, Garbo went out of his way to say how disgusted he was at the negligence, stating that, "I cannot accept any excuses, and were it not for my ideals, I would abandon my work." A clever embellishment it was. Part of the deception of Operation Fortitude was to convince the Germans that a group of 11 fictitious divisions were stationed in southeast Britain. The plan was supported by thousands of inflatable tanks and planes, which from the air looked real. Garbo reported that the Allies were planning to use these divisions for another, bigger invasion, and thus the first landing should really only be considered a diversion, when in reality, it was the real thing. The Germans Germans were so convinced by Garbo's reports that they kept 21 divisions in the Pas de Calais, where they expected this second invasion to happen. So as the fighting raged on below them, hundreds of thousands of Germany's finest soldiers sat doing nothing, waiting for an attack that would never come. Despite Germany's increasingly dire situation as the war came to a close, they continued to be so impressed with Garbo's reports that they awarded him the Iron Cross in July of 1944. The award was the highest honor available in the German military, and it even required Hitler's personal authorization. Coincidentally, he also received the Order of the British Empire directly from King George for his service as a double agent. The Germans never realized that they'd been fooled, and Garbo maintained the unique distinction of having earned decorations from both sides during the war. After World War II, Garbo feared retaliation from surviving Nazis, so with the help of MI5, he faked his own death in 1949 and moved all the way to Venezuela with his family. There, he lived a quiet life, running a bookstore and a gift shop for the rest of his working career. During the 40th anniversary of D-Day on June 6, 1984, Garbo actually traveled back to Normandy to visit the beaches and pay his respects to the fallen soldiers. He died 4 years later and is buried in a coastal village in Venezuela. Thanks for listening.